Net worth was used to further enhance his financial standing, intentionally misrepresenting his financials to obtain incredible economic benefit. It was a scheme that, by its very nature, became more profitable over time. And it is all in stark violation of the law.
The lawsuit, which seeks to bar the Trumps from doing business in New York, as well as to fine them to the tune of $250 million, reads in part, quote, "The number of grossly inflated asset values is staggering, affecting most, if not all, of the real estate holdings in any given year. All told, Trump, the Trump org, and the other defendants, as part of a repeated pattern and common scheme, derived more than 200 false and misleading valuations of assets." The AG's office also making it clear that the scheme, which James describes as astounding, was directed from the tippy top of the organization. Once again, from the lawsuit, quote, "These acts of fraud and misrepresentation were approved at the highest levels of the Trump org, including by Trump himself." In a statement, attorneys for Donald Trump and the Trump org deny any wrongdoing and accuse Tish James of blah, blah, blah playing politics. It's actually an allegation that has already been before a federal court and rejected. It happened last December. A district court judge dismissed a lawsuit by Trump seeking to block Tish James' investigation and rejecting Trump's claims that the probe was politically motivated. For her part, James said that her lawsuit and the criminal referral she's making to the IRS and the Justice Department is simply about holding Donald Trump and his family to the same standard as every American.
Claiming you have money that you do not have does not amount to the art of the deal. It's the art of the steal.
And that is where we begin today with some of our most favorite reporters and friends. With me at the table again, NBC News investigations correspondent Tom Winter. Plus, we have Neil Katyal joining us, former acting Solicitor General, now a Georgetown law professor and MSNBC legal analyst. Also, the great Suzanne Craig is here, New York Times investigative reporter whose work covering Trump's finances has earned her and her colleagues a Pulitzer Prize. And David Fahrenthold is also here. He's also at the New York Times now, an investigative reporter and also a Pulitzer Prize winner when he was at the Washington Post for his reporting on Trump's charitable giving. Both of them MSNBC contributors. Tom Winter, I start with you. What leaps out?
A couple of different things. First off, the scope of this, that it continued up until 2020 when Trump by that point had to, according to the Attorney General's office, had to know that he was under investigation, or at least questions were well swirling about what was going on in his world. And yet that, according to the Attorney General, didn't lead them to step off the gas, that they kept going with some of these evaluations that she now questions. So I think that that's interesting, number one. Number two,
that he was committing fraud while he was president.
While apparently he was under investigation. And so I think that those are two kind of glaring points, according to the Attorney General's office. Another thing that sticks out, I mean, you mentioned the potential $250 million disgorgement, obviously the potential for a lifetime ban of the Trumps, not just the former president running his company, but this idea, and it's an issue that we're really starting to dig into from a reporting standpoint, which is what is the future of Donald Trump just from a financial standpoint and his family? I mean, the other penalty here that effectively would bar him from getting any sort of new loan for any bank that's registered with the New York State Department of Finance. How far does that go? He's already, as we've previously reported in the NBC News investigative unit, he's already up against it on a number of loans, and some loans are starting to come due. And so he might need to roll those over, get additional financing. What does that mean going forward? That could certainly impact his properties. Is he going to get to a point here where he's going to have to really start selling some things off just to be able to pay the bills, so to speak, as it relates to this case? So those are certainly things that jumped off. I know you want to get into it. Certainly the criminal referrals, I think everybody paid a lot of attention to this morning, because that may indicate that there's more or new information potentially for federal prosecutors to look at.
David Fahrenthold, your first reactions to what you heard from the AG and what you've read in her lawsuit?
Well, this may just be me, but the thing that I was struck by was we've all, journalists, have been looking for a long time at these statements of financial condition, which were basically Trump's brag sheets about his finances, to look for places where he might have misled lenders or insurers. And we thought we found a lot, but the AG found so much more. She mentioned more than 20 properties, more than 200 examples, that it touched even things like how many square feet is the apartment where Trump lives in Trump Tower. According to her, every little piece of this was exaggerated or outright invented. documented. So even I, who looked at these things for a long time, was surprised at how she'd found falsehoods and exaggerations basically everywhere and every year in these sheets.
Suzanne, she had access to an amount of material that seemed to swell. The Supreme Court opened up her access to some of those documents. Her ongoing investigation opened up even more. And I wonder your reaction, having, as David said, and Tom as well, having investigated some of these open questions for a long time. What do you make of what you saw in this lawsuit today?
Well, I was just reading it before I came on air, and David's comments do resonate, because one of the things I was just, wishing that we've had during our investigations, the accountant, Donald Bender, was interviewed. They have so much information, and he's saying, look, I didn't get this information. They either didn't send it to me or I got other information. And it just shows, and, the accounting firm that Donald Trump was using has severed ties with him. But just the depth of information that they had and the people that they were able to interview, it was very rich in reading it. I'm still not done. And we'll probably go through it several more times tonight. But just every page was like, wow, this is incredible. You're just looking at, one of the things I'm always interested in is their charitable donations, and just looking at the allegations. And, they've been out there that they would put very high valuations on their charitable donations, these land donations that they had, because then they would get a great tax break. A lot more detail about things like that we have wondered about, that have been in the public purview, but just a lot more underlying information there.
So, Neil, I have always tried to understand Trump through the patterns. And my sort of take on him after 6 years of covering now is that they're not new moves, they're just new grifts. And so to me, what I saw in some of the documents that are cited is he lied to his accountant, who then would vouch for valuations the same way he lied to Christina Robb about the Mar-a-Lago classified documents. The pattern is always the same. This was another exhibit of that pattern.
100%, Nicole. So this new lawsuit is basically alleging that Donald Trump ignored outside experts and advice, that he inflated his personal value, and he roped his family and friends into supporting the fraud. And, say what you will, Donald Trump ran his business the way he ran the country. And you're absolutely right. It's pattern after pattern. Now, to be sure, this is a civil lawsuit. So if it's successful, as I suspect it will be, it won't land Donald Trump in prison. There are criminal implications that we can talk about in a minute. But I think Tom Winter is exactly right to say that this really does put a huge financial, it puts him at huge financial risk, with a lifetime ban on the Trump Organization, loans being called, and all sorts of things. I guess on the other hand, the New York Attorney General is also seeking to bar the Trump family from acquiring real estate for the next 5 years. And given Trump's average return on investment, she might be doing him a favor. I don't know. But to me, what really stood out is the devastating range in this complaint. 200 examples, over 222 pages, and it feels ironclad. I mean, remember that Alan Weisselberg, who was Trump's CFO, has already pled guilty to these offenses. 15 different felonies he pled to. 15 felonies, and somehow I don't think that Alan Weisselberg is the one who committed the most crimes here.
So a former prosecutor described the evidence that she's marshaled to me as being presented in, quote, mind-numbing detail. And he said that the conduct spans 10 years and a pattern that we've been talking about over valuations that is kind of undeniable. And I want to turn to what the criminal investigation would look like. SDNY obviously had access to Michael Cohen, but the document production and what is in her complaint, I don't see Michael Cohen's name anywhere. I mean, clearly, if he was the match that started this, what has been filled out is hundreds of pages now of evidence based on documents that are indisputable.
I mean, already on the public docket are 10 years of the former president's personal financial statements, or at least his presentation of his wealth. And when you start to go through, and I'm there with Suzanne, I mean, it's going to be another, a day or two, I think, of reading through this thing before it all sinks in. You see email exchanges, I mean, paragraph to paragraph, point to point, where they're pointing out, okay, this person says to do this person says to do that. So the civil complaint, if it's to be believed, is built on top of kind of real-time, contemporaneous communications and notes about exactly what the business was doing or trying to do at the moment it was trying to do that. Are these email messages new? Are they new types of evidence that they can hand over to the Southern District or the IRS Criminal Division? And if so, is it going to be just a strict, hey, here you go, and hand it over to them? Or is it going to be the type of thing where they say, here's our roadmap and you guys can, go with your own federal grand jury subpoenas? So there's probably a couple of different ways that they could go with it, but it certainly would allow them the path to move forward if there's, and this is the big, kind of the big turning point here. One, does it violate federal law in statute? That's more of a Neil question than a Tom question. And then the second thing is, this is a civil case versus a criminal case, and the bar is higher in a criminal case. That's just known, and I know you know that. So when you look at this in totality, are they going to be able to tie that all together? I still think, though, the immediate threat for the president, who's facing an ongoing criminal investigation involving classified documents that we've talked about a lot this week, the idea and prospect of him losing his business, his legacy, his kids' business, their legacy, I think compounded with these other investigations, even if his political funds are helping to support that defense effort, still is really starting to become an anvil over him as far as moving forward and maybe his calculus. Then that becomes a political calculus. That's much more your world than mine.
No, but they're all this. I mean, to your point, they're totally, you can't separate one from the other because the fervor on the politics, the taking on the QAnon people is about losing his legacy and his business and his family fortune.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's starting to look at some chips that are pretty well stacked against him. He got no favors in front of the special master yesterday, and so he's looking at a situation where he's fighting a lot of legal battles on all fronts. Now, I know people say, well, you guys have been talking about investigations for years. You're talking about every single development. First things first, we talk about developments involving the current or former president of the United States because those are huge developments. And so the reporting that David's done, Suzanne's done, has been incredibly important over the years just to understand the person who was at the time running or the president of the United States. Number two, no guarantees are made as far as any sort of investigations bearing fruit from an indictment or a civil standpoint. Analysts are free to make those judgments. That's what they're paid to do. They have the expertise to do it. Finally, when you look at all of these investigations now that we have been talking about, we've been talking about this one today in particular for years, they're all starting to come to a point, and they're all starting to come to a conclusion, and they're not concluding with a we can't really bring a case. They're not concluding with a we're not going to sue. They're concluding with we're suing. They're concluding with we're getting a search warrant for the former president's residence. So all these things are starting to come together in a way that points for significant legal trouble on the horizon, not just political trouble because, Special Counsel Mueller brought somebody else in today to talk to. No. He's bringing in people, or these people are bringing in people and are actually making cases directly against the now former president of the United States. I think that's a point that shouldn't be lost in all this.
I mean, it's a pretty powerful point coming from you, Tom. I know you have to go. I know you develop a twitch if you have to sit on TV and not dive into the documents themselves. So I'm going to let you go. But just one more. I mean, what has changed, though, is the evidence and the access to the evidence. And this case is all on paper. This is all about what she saw. It's about, and I just want to put up one before you go because it's a perfect example. This is something that everyone can understand as illegal, cheating, and fraudulent. This is Tish James on how he lied about how much his apartment was worth.
Mr. Trump represented that his apartment spanned more than 30,000 square feet, which was the basis for valuing the apartment. In reality, the apartment had an area of less than 11,000 square feet, something that Mr. Trump was well aware of. And based on that inflated square footage, the value of the apartment in 2015 and 2016 was $327 million. To this date, no apartment in New York City has ever sold for close to that amount. Tripling the size of the apartment for purposes of the valuation was intentional and deliberate fraud, not an honest mistake.
And then we've got, from the lawsuit itself, this is the power, I guess, of what you're describing, the legal process sort of combing through its witnesses, including Donald Trump. So when asked about the scheme she just described there, he invoked his Fifth Amendment privilege. The question, you are aware that from 2012 to 2016, the value of your triplex apartment in Trump Tower was calculated by multiplying 30,000 square feet times the price per square foot. Is that right? Same answer. He takes the fifth. And you personally directed the use of 30,000 square feet in valuing your apartment for the statement of financial condition. Same answer. He takes the fifth. The 30,000 square foot figure is false. Is that right? Same answer. When you directed the use of that square footage to value your triplex, you knew that the 30,000 square foot figure was false. Takes the fifth. So she's got the lie. She's got Trump.
Well, and she also has a deposition. And that deposition and those comments, if this does go to a jury trial, is something that is admissible. So what you just did is presumably what a prosecutor might do in a year, 2 years' time from now in presenting this going forward. This is not a case based on what we've been told today by the Attorney General. We're relying on Michael Cohen's statement, Stormy Daniels' statement, anybody's statement. We're relying on, we have the president actually answering questions in front of a live questioner, not somebody who submitted him written questions, and we have documents, financials, and math that's occurring here. Undoubtedly, the Trump side, and they already are tweeting about it, questioning the math here.
He doesn't get to tweet. They're doing something
That's a good point.
Social.
His children are tweeting about this. But when you look at this, it is a very different case than some of the actions that have been brought before or some of the investigations that have been brought before.
Tom Winter, thank you so much for your reporting. You are now free to go report. I want to play for you something, David Fahrenthold, that caught my attention. It's a question from Josh Gerstein to Attorney General Tish James.
Do they just not check anything that people tell them, or they presumed it was true, or did they have hints that these things were not true that they were being told? And what does it tell you about those institutions that they would take his word for it?
So let me just say, with respect to Ms. Orrs indicated on the statement of financial condition that they did not certify and they did not audit these statements. That does not absolve Mr. Trump of submitting accurate information. Two, with respect to Cushman Wakefield, there is an ongoing investigation into Cushman Wakefield. And then lastly, with respect to Deutsche Bank, we're in conversations with Deutsche Bank. They have been cooperating with our office.
I mean, what she pulls the curtain back on, David Fahrenthold, is a very far-ranging investigation that has checked all the boxes of any potential participants in the fraud.
Yeah, this is important here. One of the questions that they're going to have to answer in this case is, well, this is real estate. Everybody fudges the numbers. Everybody says their properties are the greatest. So how do you draw a line that separates just sort of normal puffery from fraud? And I think the way they're going to try to do it is by showing that, look, they did talk to experts. They did talk to appraisers. They talked to people, they had access to real people who saw this from an objective point of view and told them their numbers were totally wrong, not even in the same ballpark. And then knowing the right answer or knowing the range of the right answer, they chose to ignore it. I think that will go towards showing the kind of intent they would need to prove to show that this was not just an honest mistake or sort of normal real estate flim-flam, but something far beyond that moved into the realm of fraud.
Suzanne, we learned from your reporting that flim-flam was not the family way. It was this sprawling and audacious pattern of fraud passed down from the father.
Right. As Tom Winter was talking, I was thinking about it. What we're seeing here is such a pattern, whether it's this case that we're talking about, the civil case today, or the criminal case against the Trump organization that's going to trial in October. It's just case after case after case where they just are really either they're pushing the line or they're moving it right into illegal behavior. You think about the criminal case that's going forward where Ellen Weiselberg has already entered guilty pleas on it. There he was, they had just incident after incident where he would take tuition or a car, and those are taxable benefits, and they were never recorded as that. And then you look at that and you look at today's case, and it's just a pattern of behavior that it's really alarming. We uncovered it in our reporting, and we're seeing it play out in the legal arena, and it's just it's something, because we've been talking about it for a long time, but it never can't really cease to sort of shock you when you see it.
So, Neil, I gauge how shocked I'm going to feel by how shocked reporters like Tom and David and Suzanne feel. And when they're shocked by the criminal sort of behavior around finances, for me, it elevates the story and it elevates the evidence she's marshaled. So I guess my question for you, Neil, is why isn't there a criminal prosecution already underway by SDNY?
Well, there may be an investigation. We don't know. Today in the complaint on page 2, the New York Attorney General isolated a list of federal crimes that she thought were potentially violated. And I think the thing that this lawsuit did was collect all the reporting from our friends on this show, but then add to it all the evidence from the accountants, the evidence from the CFO and others. And it's a case based on a huge amount of paperwork, which is unlike a lot of the other investigations that Trump has faced, where his allies like Kash Patel can just make up stories to protect him. This is based on cold facts in paperwork that is under the Trump organization. I think Donald Trump probably at this point wishes he could flush some of those financial statements down the toilet right now. There's a big difference between what's going on in this attorney general suit and a criminal one. And one part of it is the burden of proof, which in a criminal case is beyond a reasonable doubt, a very high standard that the prosecution has to show for all sorts of good reasons before you can put someone in jail. But in a civil case is just a preponderance of the evidence, 51% or something like that. As I say, this New York one is a civil case. So the standard of proof is lower, but the other piece about it is all of these times that Donald Trump and his family took the Fifth Amendment, hundreds of times in the New York Attorney General's investigation. In a criminal case, because of our Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination, you can't draw any sort of inference when someone takes the Fifth Amendment. But in the civil case, you can. So this New York case is actually a much easier case because the jury can be shown exactly, Nicole, what you just put on the screen, where Trump refused to answer question after question about these property values, and the jury is going to be told by the judge, you can infer from the fact that he's not trying to say he's innocent and dispute this, that he isn't. So it's a huge difference. And so if you're a prosecutor, you might actually want to start and let that civil lawsuit unfold first, and then bring the criminal case later. It seems like a good criminal case at this point based on what I'm seeing in the complaint.
All right, we're going to continue to dig into this part of the story. Tish James today name-checked Michael Cohen, or at least called him out for his role in this, sparking or being the genesis of the investigation. We'll show you some of what he had testified to publicly next. Plus, the ex-president's problems, of course, do not start and stop with Letitia James. The January 6th Congressional Committee will hold another public hearing 1 week from today. We'll look at all the things that have changed in this country since we last heard from them in a public way, including a huge ramp-up of the Justice Department's parallel probe into January 6th, and trying to isolate another world leader on the world stage, President Biden this morning, on the dangerous aggression coming from Russia's Vladimir Putin, who today indicated doubled down on threats of using nuclear weapons. We'll talk about all that when Deadline White House continues after a quick break. Don't go anywhere.
It was my experience that Mr. Trump inflated his total assets when it served his purposes, such as trying to be listed amongst the wealthiest people in Forbes, and deflated his assets to reduce his real estate taxes.
But to your knowledge, did the president ever provide inflated assets to a bank in order to help him obtain a loan?
These documents and others were provided to Deutsche Bank on one occasion where I was with them in our attempt to obtain money so that we can put a bid on the Buffalo Bills.
That moment right there may ultimately have led to today's bombshell announcement from Tish James. That was Trump's former personal attorney, Michael Cohen, at a House hearing back in 2019, alleging that Donald Trump routinely manipulated the value of his assets and then deflated them when it served him. We're back with Neil, Suzanne, and David. Neil, what happens next in the civil suit? What is the next step?
Well, I suspect that Trump will file some sort of motion to dismiss, saying that, these allegations aren't proven. So he'll write a long brief if he can find a lawyer to write it for him. And then the government will respond in their brief, and then there'll be an oral argument on this. That can take a long time. Civil litigation moves fairly slowly, so this isn't something that we should expect is going to be done with any rapid speed. And of course, Trump's whole playbook is always delay, delay, delay. So when you ask me what's the first thing what's going to happen next, I'm sure it's going to be some motion for delay, because Trump always files those.
Neil, let me just put up what is alleged in the lawsuit again. I mean, so he represented Mar-a-Lago's value at $739 million. I've driven by. I don't know much about mansions, but that sounds like a really, really expensive mansion. And it turns out the real value is $75 million. It's like not even close. So, I mean, do you say like, oh, I missed a column? I mean, and the same thing with Park Avenue. He said it was $135 million. It's actually $84 million. He said Trump Seven Springs was worth $291 million. It's not even close. It's worth $56 million. I mean, what is the innocent explanation for such flagrant lying?
Well, I mean, I suppose with Mar-a-Lago, he can say it was worth $739 million once you count the street value of all the classified information that was there that he could sell off to other countries or something. I don't think that it's going to be easy for him. So I don't think the defense is going to be twofold, I suspect. One is, he had nothing to do with it. That was his people, his accountants, this and that and the other. And that's why I think that language you pointed to from Tish James's statement today about Donald Trump personally orchestrating this stuff, that this came from the top, is going to be so important. But nonetheless, that is going to be, a big argument. The other big argument was teed up by the Josh Gerstein question, which is everyone is puffing in real estate. And there were very sophisticated financial, entities on the other side, like Deutsche Bank and the like. And if they didn't see anything wrong, isn't this just kind of industry standard? And I think, maybe a few dollars here or there may be industry standard, but going from, as you say, a $75 million property to a $739 million property in Mar-a-Lago, or saying that your apartment is 30,000 square feet when it's 11,000 square feet, and representing it to be the most expensive real estate sale ever in the history of New York City by far, at some point it doesn't pass a smell test. And both for civil and criminal, these are really easy things for a jury to understand. This isn't complicated stuff. People get it. And so if I'm Trump right now, I'm feeling incredibly worried, not just about the civil lawsuit, but that the civil one is going to mature and flower into a criminal one as well.
Neil Katyal, I know you have to leave us. Thank you for spending time with us today. David Fahrenthold, my question for you, in your body of reporting, and in Suzanne's as well, Trump isn't just in the room. He is making all the calls. He's the quarterback in everything. He picks his walk-up music at his rallies, which is why it's hard for his staff to walk away from the small stuff, because he is obsessed with the small stuff. He didn't like certain candidates for cabinet jobs because of the way they look. So putting him in the room feels like an easy thing to do. How difficult does that make the efforts to defend this flagrant fraud?
Well, his layer of protection has typically been that he doesn't use email. So there's no written paper trail of him saying do this or do that. And you'd have to find somebody from this very small circle of people, from which only Michael Cohen has ever left, to say that he told me verbally to do this. That's why I think the charges against Trump's children and the emails that they sent is so interesting, because they do use email, and they're in this complaint using email. And so the question would be, well, if Trump didn't say it, well, now I see Ivanka, Eric, Don Jr. issuing these orders over email. Did they do it on their own? If not, you sort of have to choose one or the other. If they're acting on their own, then they have the responsibility. And if they're not, then their father has responsibility. I think that's why she's included evidence from them and included them in this suit, because you can't sort of have one without the other. Somebody's taking responsibility, so which Trump is going to take that fall?
It is so interesting, Suzanne, that the kids are in the lawsuit, because a normal dynamic, people go down to protect their kids. This is not that. This is not normal. And we know from Don Jr.'s email, when offered oppo from the Russians about Hillary Clinton, quote, "If it's what you say it is, I love it," end quote. What do you think is in this trove of emails from the kids?
Well, I think there's a lot of back and forth between different whether there's some from people who've done appraisals, but you're seeing the kids were each had their own discrete area, and you're seeing emails where they're going back and forth about an appraisal. Eric Trump was very involved with Seven Springs. He comes into it there about the appraisal that was done for the land, a charitable donation there. And I think that's what you're going to see. And they all had their sort of discrete area. So you see them across the lawsuit touching very different areas.
David, what if you sort of dive through, everything that was introduced today by this lawsuit and the copious amount of paper that she's marshaled to file this lawsuit? Where does your sort of line of questions, where do you go in your head in terms of what you want to know next?
Well, I guess I want to know more about how they establish how they connect the dots to Trump, how they overcome those two defenses we talked about earlier. We don't have any of Trump's emails in here because he doesn't use email. And how do you overcome it's just real estate, everything's fair in real estate. How do you overcome those defenses? And I think that they will they will overcome those by saying, look, he lied to the people who then represented himself to the world. He lied to his accountants, he lied to his appraisers. And also that, within the puffery of these appraisals, there were specific facts that weren't exaggerated, that weren't sort of guesswork, that were wrong. He said he could develop X number of lots when really the number was half of that. He said he had the right to develop Mar-a-Lago into homes when he actually had given that up long ago. If there's specific false facts that underlie those bigger numbers, and it's a lot harder to defend those numbers as just like, well, I took an optimistic guess. You can't sue me for that.
All right, David Van Vold, thank you so much for being part of our coverage. We have roped Suzanne Craig into sticking around a little bit longer. She stays with us. For Donald Trump,
is that I'm very rich. I'm really rich. I'm proud of my net worth. I've done an amazing job. I ventured into Manhattan and did a lot of great deals. And now I'm building all over the world, and I love what I'm doing.
Let me be perfectly honest. I know that makes most of you want to throw up in your mouth, but it's how he became president. His supporters loved all that stuff. And it turns out, we learned today, it was all a lie. And it's the moment he hoped would never, ever, ever, ever happen. A lawsuit directly targeting his empire, the lie he created mostly for TV. An entire TV show empire was built on it. Became the foundation for the big lies he'd tell as our country's president and commander-in-chief. Joining Suzanne Craig, let's bring in former U.S. Attorney and former Deputy Assistant Attorney General Harry Litman. Tim O'Brien also joins us, Senior Executive Editor for Bloomberg Opinion and an MSNBC contributor. Tim writes in a new column about Trump's business now finally facing a serious reckoning thanks to his penchant for inflating his wealth, his achievements, and his abilities. Tim, I want to start with your piece. Tish James's lawsuit won't land the Trumps in prison. Only criminal convictions could do that, but it seeks to bar the Trumps from running a business in New York State and may unravel the Trump org. Trump brought the family business in Manhattan and the spotlight. Now, for the second time in his career, he has put the family's business legacy on the precipice. Trash canning the New York remnants of what his father started about a century ago will weigh on Trump, regardless of what he says about it.
Yeah, he's journalists and his business competitors, Nicole, have known for years that all of his carnivalesque behavior involves sometimes lies, sometimes exaggerations, but little of what he said about his business dealings in Manhattan were true. The clip that you played from The Apprentice in which he says he's the biggest real estate developer in Manhattan, he has never been, either by the value of what he owned or the scale and scope of what he owned. The difference is, though that kind of behavior never exposed him to existential legal consequences. And this is the first time that I think his business dealings have come under the legal scope with this kind of precision and with the potential that the family business will effectively end in New York State. I think Tish James has a hurdle here in front of her to convict him. He was dealing with sophisticated banks. They were banks, like many in New York, that knew Trump was mendacious, that knew Trump was a grifter, and I think did some of their own due diligence, regardless of what he told them his properties were worth. So that is going to be a hurdle. On the other hand, I think there's a legal case to be made that his mere attempt to try to mislead may be damning enough. And I think those are some of the things that Tish James is going to have to convince a jury of. She doesn't have to show intent. She can introduce the fact that Donald and Eric both took the fifth hundreds of times, and that the jury can interpret that as a possible admission of guilt. You can't do that in a criminal suit. So she's got some leeway here with the jury. But at the end of the day, I do think it is the arc of the Trump family's life in New York City as developers and as business people could come to a very rocky and ugly close as the result of this lawsuit.
Suzanne, the arc is also a lie, though. I mean, your great reporting was captured in a documentary on Showtime that shows that if an arc goes like this, what was over here was all fake, too. Let me show this sort of the family business, Trump's taxes, and the myth of being self-made.
The family did not want attention drawn to that sale. We spent months going through public records, just trying to figure out what was transferred and what the price was.
Where's the mortgage document, just so we've got it noted?
It's on the drive, yeah, under property records, and then there's a separate folder for 220.
And we started to realize not only was there that one big payday, there was dozens of streams of revenue from Fred to Donald.
So back to sort of the montage that I started at the beginning of this block. The whole thing was stagecrafted.
Well, let's start with the montage where, Tim made the great point. He's not the biggest real estate developer in New York. You also just look at what was put up on that screen, Trump Ice. It's horrible business. It's no longer around. Taj Mahal, it's gone. I could keep going. And then you also have at the core of this, and he ran for president on this idea that he was a self-made man, a self-made billionaire. Nothing could be further from the truth. He is the son of an incredibly successful real estate developer, Fred Trump, who he inherited hundreds of millions of dollars from. And just beyond that, Fred Trump propped Donald Trump up at every turn of his career, particularly when he was starting out. Donald Trump has talked about how he got $1 million loan from his father, and he built that into an empire, and he has used that lie and told it to the American people and then said, vote for me. And that's the sort of, great imaginative thinking that I will bring to this country. And it's just all a lie.
It's just amazing. I want to read you, Harry, another poll from Tish James's lawsuit implicating the kids. They're not kids. The grown adults that are also being sued today. As executive vice presidents of the Trump org, Donald Trump Jr., Ivanka Trump, and Eric Trump were also aware of and knowingly participated in the scheme. Indeed, the fraudulent scheme was integral to the business of the Trump org and required the participation of Trump and his children. As executive vice presidents, the three children were intimately involved in the operation of the Trump organization's business. They were aware of the true financial performance of the company, whether through Donald Trump Jr.'s work on commercial leasing, Ivanka Trump's work on Doral, Trump Chicago, and OPO, or Eric Trump's work on the golf course portfolio, which of course brought us the great revelation that they had all the money they needed from Russia. Is this the civil version of the kind of evidence that would be marshaled in a RICO investigation and prosecution?
Yeah, look, it's pretty close. And what would a RICO would show that they themselves were a criminal organization. But and what is this? It's the equivalent, but as to the Trump brand, which has always been so important to him and, of course, to his children. Basically, it's the entire business. People have noted this, but just to put a finer point on it, all the properties, Scotland, Florida, whatever, they're involved because he uses them in New York to inflate the value. So a lot of people are clamoring for Trump the person to be in an orange jumpsuit. May or may not ever happen, even if he's convicted. But to the extent Trump the brand has been, equated with him as he's wanted it to, this is an absolute cannon shot against Trump the brand. And I think it is basically indefensible on their part. Yes, there are some difficulties. Tim has just mentioned some burden of proof and the like. But I don't see how you bring this case to a jury. Just listen to what he said at the top of this segment here. A jury would loathe him. Put on top of that the lower burden of proof and the wildly inflated valuations. This is really an existential threat to what is second only to his physical person, and that is the Trump brand, now, in the past, and in history. This is, I would argue, the future is now, as it were. Everyone's waiting for things to start. I think given the kind of mortal threat this is to the brand itself, we are now in the period where a reckoning has begun.
The reckoning